Hello and welcome to another episode of Embrace Your Outdoor Space. My name's Tommy Cross, and in this episode I'm going to show you how to build your very own vertical planter, because if your backdrops are looking bare, or if you want to give your fence a flourish or add blossoms and blooms to your boundaries, this is one of the easiest ways to do it, and all you need is a few staple tools and a bit of old scrap timber. Up first, we need our tools. In order to speed the process up, I would opt that you go for a cordless drill or impact driver. You're gonna need a saw to cut your timber. You can either use a hand saw, or if you really want to speed up the process, you could always opt for a battery-powered circular saw. And lastly, we need some lumber. Now, I'm gonna be using some old scaffold boards, but if you don't have these to hand, you could always use some regular lengths of scrap timber. Well, where do you get your scrap timber? Well, the easiest way is to find a skip.
Oi! What the f?
But please make sure you ask permission first. And lastly, fire! Before we decide on how big our planter is going to be, we need to decide exactly what size our planter is going to sit into. Now in this case, I'm going to cover up this area here because there's absolutely nothing exciting about this backdrop at the moment. I want to add some color to it. So I've already pre-cut my plywood in order so it fits into my aperture. Now this ply is going to form the backdrop of our planter. I'm going to work with a rough sawn timber face because I'm using some old scaffold boards. But if you want to give those greens a real punch and a pop, then you could always paint that backdrop to suit the color of the fence that you're going to fix it onto. Prepare your workspace. It's a good thing we're building a planter, because now I've got some plants that need a home. Oh no, my poor violas. Dear, oh dear. Now, the first thing we need to do in order to create our planter is to create the sides, because they are going to dictate the angle. When I cut the length of my sides, I want to make sure that the bottom is the same length as the width of the timber that I'm using. So in this case, I'm using a scaffold board. So when I fix them to each other, I've got a perfect match at the bottom. In this case, I'm going to use a 45-degree angle. And that way, when fixed against the wall, we're going to get enough space in order for the plant to be planted into, and we've got that perfect angle where it will retain enough water from rainfall that allow just enough to run off without soaking the soil too much. Top tip, if you're using a conventional handsaw, most handsaws when placed up against the timber will give you either a 90-degree or a 45-degree. Our handle is actually angled at 45 degrees. By butting that up against the bottom of our timber, we'll be able to get a quick, easy, true 45 degrees. Now for my planter, I'm gonna have 2 troughs, so I'm gonna need 4 sides. So I'm gonna cut 4 pieces of timber to create the sides of my planter. Okay, so I'm gonna use one of my initial cuts as a template, just to make sure I'm as close as possible, but as with everything, measure twice, cut once. So I'm gonna double check the measurement before I cut it. Now, because we're upcycling and using reclaimed timber, there may be slight differences in the timber widths and lengths. We don't know where they've all been used, but that all adds to the appeal. We're looking for that rustic aesthetic when we're finished. Doesn't matter if you're a millimeter or so out, because you are going to get fluctuation and changes when that timber's out in the elements. So we've constructed our shelf arms. Now we need to create the base and the front using our timber lengths. I've got a space which requires 69 centimeters in width. So obviously I'm going to cut down my timbers to 29 centimeters width. What you didn't see earlier on is that I actually pared my plywood and I've cut it to 60 centimeters in width. That's going to give the backdrop for my new planters. So I need a length of timber for the base and for the front, 60 centimeters in length. Or do I? No, because my base is going to sit inside our 2 arms and my front is going to sit on front of that. So we need to deduct the width of our timbers for the base, and then the front will obviously be 60 centimeters in length, I think. It will. Our scaffold boards are 35 millimeters in width, so that means I need to add 35 millimeters and 35 millimeters, which is 7 centimeters. So we need to deduct 7 centimeters from our 60 centimeter length, so 53 centimeters. Now you're probably thinking, why am I going to all this effort for a space this small? But if you've got a small garden, this may be the only real estate that you've got in order to propagate with pollinators. And if you want those beautiful butterflies coming in, or the buzz of a bee flitting from flower to flower, this is one of the easiest ways and one of the cheapest ways to get color and interest at height. Now the virtue of using battery powered tools is it means I can go from tool to tool, and all I need to do is change my battery out from one to the other. Makes it much easier to do, and I'm not having to be tethered and tangled with cords and cables. Essentially it means I've got a much safer working environment. So now we have one base, two sides, screw those from the outside in. That will secure the base. If everything's measured out correctly, oh, would you look at that? To the millimeter, Paul. Don't linger on it too long, just in case it isn't. Let's get driving. I'm going to use an impact driver. You could do it manually. I wouldn't recommend it. It's no fun. Before we start screwing about, the first thing I need to do is pilot hole. This way I will stop any cracking or splitting of the timbers. It also means when I drive my screw in, it's going to go in nice and tight. Swap my battery from one tool to the other. And I'm going to use a keyless chuck drill. In order to attach the drill bit, just hold on and press on slowly. So I've now got my drill bit in order to create a pilot hole, so my screw is going to drive in nice and true. Now in this case, because we're going to have this full of compost, there's going to be a reasonable amount of weight, so I'm going to use a 2.5 inch screw. Make sure you get an external grade screw. We don't want those breaking or rusting. Now, you know, I mentioned earlier on about not being too accurate, and although I was incredibly accurate, my timber isn't. So although I'm flush on this edge here, you can see this piece of timber is slightly drunk. And that's not because of mismeasurement, it's because the timber has bowed out. But we can persuade that back in with a gentle bit of pressure and some screws and lock that back into position. But you may find that sometimes you just might have to cut your front timber on a slight angle to make sure you compensate for that. So with that in mind, it's time to screw the front on, get that nice and secure, and then we've got the shell of our first planter trough. Okay, so that's our first planter frame done. So repeat the same process on our second, or if you've got more space for more planters, repeat as necessary. You could sand these down using either a grinder and a sanding pad, or just an orbital sander in order to give you a more kind of cosmetic finish. Personally, I'm going to stick with the rough look, and in order to accentuate that rough texture. Now using a plumber's torch or a blowtorch or a heat gun, you can actually bring out the oils in the timber, and that's going to really accentuate the color. So you'll see I'll go from this lighter texture to a much darker, deeper shade. But try not to get too carried away. So with our timber tanned, it's ready to apply it to our ply. Now the way to do this is to lay it onto a flat surface, and then you're going to grab your pre-cut plyboard and you're going to screw that from the back into our widths on the outside edge. Once your planters are fixed to your plywood, all that remains is to lift and fix it firmly to your fence or wall. Obviously, make sure that you've got structural integrity on your fence line or your wall before you fix it firmly. Well, I'm truly spoiled today because not only do I get to finish with fire, but now I get to finish with a final flourish of flowers. Now we've got a semi-shady area here, so I'm going to have a mixture of both shade-loving and sun-basking plants. So in this section here and at this time of year, I'm going to go for a mixture of things like erysimum. Now sadly this is a little bit behind where it should be, but it's very, very popular with gardeners because it provides so much value. It keeps flowering and flowering and flowering, and even if it gets caught by late frost, will still put out a bounty of colour for you. And we've seen the celosia underneath that's going to pierce through this foliage with those wonderful, vibrant, purpley pink heads. And then trailing down the front here, we've got some more breccia. This will always do very, very well in amongst rockeries or cracks and crevices. And then we're going to dress it off with some of my favourites, some violas. That's just going to give us constant colour. I'm also going to throw in some fuchsias as well, because they're like a little bit of sunshine, a little bit of shade, and they're pretty much going to look after themselves. And those dangling droplets of flowers are going to entice those bees into the garden, and those bees are essential to our ecosystem. We're also going to add some incredible edibles as well. So I'm going to add a bit of parsley, thyme and lemon thyme for foliage and flavour. Now I'm going to finish off with some hedera spilling over the front as a final flourish. And it's particularly useful having some extra planting space, because if you're like me and you visit a garden centre or a plant nursery, that extra real estate really comes in handy, especially if you've bought more plants than your beds and borders can bear. And if you're looking for power tools to help you power your own vision in your outdoor space, don't forget you can always check out the link at the end of the video. I'm going to plant this.